With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Well, welcome in, everybody. I am sorry I'm getting the show started very, very late, but this time it actually wasn't my fault. I had some horrible camera issues. Hopefully it will bear with us, but yeah, it looked like I was living in a weird black and white world that was terribly overexposed. So hopefully the technology will participate with us. It won't try to sabotage me yet again. But you know, live show, what are you going to do? If the camera goes out, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. But whether you're joining us on YouTube Tactics, Facebook page, or the News Radio 1440 Facebook page, Twitch, Periscope, all of those places that you can watch us, we certainly appreciate you being with us on this Thursday. And since this is going to be the last day of the week, if you're listening to us on the Saturday show, listening to the Best Of show, we thank you for being with us as well. No matter how you're listening, we appreciate you making us a part of your day, and we try to earn your viewership by bringing you the best local, state, and national news that we possibly can. And it's interesting because, especially as somebody who is in the business of doing sort of education and entertainment at the same time, because of course I want the show to be informative, but I also want it to be entertaining. And a part of that is that it's my job as a broadcaster to convey to you why a particular news story is very important. I try to sort of impress the significance of you, whether it be in your personal life, whether it's to us as a country or us as a state. A big part of my job is explaining why a story is important and why you should be paying attention to it. I'm actually going to do the exact opposite of that tonight. And the reason I am is because we have been sold a bill of goods that is not there. We have been told a lie that this particular story that I'm thinking of is incredibly important. It's of the utmost importance, and we must do everything that we can to ensure that we're paying attention to it, on top of it. And there's just nothing to it. There's no truth behind that claim. And the story that I'm talking about is the one that pretty much everybody in the national news media seems to be fixated on, and it is the Mueller hearings. And so I know that normally local news always takes priority here, but I'm going to abridge that just for a second to explain to you and show you a contrast why you shouldn't be paying attention to this story and why you ought to be paying attention to our next story, which does have a local Alabama tie-in. So real quickly, this is why this story does not matter. It doesn't matter. And here's the crazy thing about this. Anyone that was paying attention to this story, and I mean paying attention to the whole shebang, or even if you just picked up this story and started really zeroing in and paying attention to the Mueller investigation in the past month, you should have known that this story was going to be a giant nothing. And the reason is because the man that stood at that hearing that came there to be questioned, Robert Mueller himself, he said that it was going to be nothing. Because when he issued his report, and then you'll remember that he came back to Congress to explain himself a little bit once the full report was out, that in his statement he said, everything that I know is in the report. If you ask me any questions, I'm just going to refer back to the report. And sure enough, Robert Mueller, whether you like him, whether you hate him, he is a man of his word, and he did exactly that. That at this hearing, we got no new information. You can look at the Mueller report, you can look at what was contained within it, and if you've already read that, and you watched all 5 hours of the Mueller hearing, You know exactly the same amount before the hearing as after the hearing, because no new information came to the surface. None whatsoever. There were a few moments that were interesting. There were a few moments that might have made you think a different way, and we're actually going to cover one of those here in just a second, because I think it's the only 2 minutes that were worth anything out of the entire 5-hour event. But as far as new information, there simply was none. And Robert Mueller told you there was none. He told you ahead of time, weeks in advance, before they even scheduled a hearing, there is no reason to call for a hearing because anything that I will say is already contained within my report. And so to anybody that knew about this, that was paying attention to this story, knew that Robert Mueller testifying was going to do nothing. Now, the Democrats tried to build it up as though there's going to be this big revelation, this big bombshell, and nobody should have been surprised when that didn't happen, because that's exactly what they've been telling us for 2 years now. They have been taunting or teasing for 2 years. Oh, there's going to be something really big, something really huge is coming up. We're about to get something. Robert Mueller is coming down. The noose is tightening. The walls are closing in on Donald Trump. We're going to get him this time. And then, of course, nothing ever actually came of it. And when the report was finally put out, nothing, again, actually came of it. And so anybody that's been paying attention to this should have known that this sort of sensationalized view of what was going to happen at this hearing, you don't even have to watch the hearing to know exactly what was going to happen. Now, I watched a big chunk of it because it's my job. But the point is, I knew going in that I was not going to learn anything I did not already know when I walked out of it. And I was right. And anybody that was thinking the same thing, they were also right. So if you want a pretty good summary of what actually happened at the hearing, you need to know virtually nothing more than what we're going to present on this program. In fact, I may be giving too much information on this event. I may be giving it more. I actually am afraid that I'm giving it more airtime and more consideration than it actually deserves. But here's a pretty good summary of what happened. The Democrats literally just read sensational parts. And there are some parts of it that are sensational. I don't think anybody would argue that, even if they are a big Trump fan. There are parts that paint the president in a bad light. And all that they did was read parts of that report and say, is that in the report? And then Robert Mueller would say, what page is it on? And they would say, it's on page 145 or something. And he'd say, yes, then that is in my report. He would literally ask them if that was what they were reading. They would say, yes, we were reading the report. And then he says, yep, then that's what I believe. Which again, told us that was what he was going to do before he even did it. So no one should be surprised about this. So the question is, the Democrats, why would they do this? Why would they intentionally waste everybody's time knowing that anything that they asked, they were asking straight from the report? They were just reading segments of the report and getting Robert Mueller to confirm it. So what was the purpose of this hearing if they were already assured that there was going to be no new information? Well, I think that there's two schools of thought on this. And frankly, I think there's probably an element of truth to both. The first is that they were looking for some kind of viral video moment. In other words, they were hoping for, even though there was absolutely no reason to believe this was going to happen, they were hoping for some moment where basically Robert Mueller became Robert De Niro in the movie A Few Good Men, where he just burst out and says, You're dang right I wanted to impeach him. You're dang right I wanted to go after him. Something sensational like that. Some kind of gotcha moment with the president, which I don't believe that even the vast majority of Democrats believed was going to happen, because if he really wanted to do that, he could have done it beforehand. Maybe they were hoping against hope that they were going to prod him in exactly the right way to where he would lose his temper and just spill the beans on that. But that didn't happen. And so then you also have the other theory, which I think is far more plausible, and this was a much larger part of the reason that they decided to have this hearing. They were afraid that the reason that people aren't moving away from the Trump movement is because they just aren't reading the report. That if you read the report, you would understand that this man absolutely needs to be impeached. But you haven't read the report, so we're going to basically take 5 hours to read the segments that make the president look the worst, and then have an actual soundbite of someone reading it, and then Robert Mueller saying yes. So I guess they were hoping that a video and the spoken word and Mueller being there himself would have more impact on people than a report that Robert Mueller wrote and signed. But I don't see why that would be the case. And so I guess the rationale was, well, people aren't reading the report, so if they've not read the report, this will give them a soundbite to where they can hear pieces of the report that they probably didn't know were in there. In other words, they weren't trying to reveal new information, they were just trying to shine a spotlight on existing information. Which, as far as a political strategy goes, would be a much better idea if the problem with it were that people just were not interested in the report. But if the report had recommended some kind of prosecution or conviction, that wouldn't be an issue in the first place. You see, what they're trying to do is they want the impeachment, but they know that they've got nothing on the guy. And so they know that it's politically unpopular and unfeasible. It would not be practical for them to go for impeachment now, because the only thing that they're going to do is get the Senate saying, no, there's no reason to impeach him, and public opinion turning on them. So they were, I think, hoping and praying that just having parts of the Mueller report that make Trump look bad, and like I said, there are parts of the report that do that. I've been very open about that since the day that it came out. They were hoping that having people hear that in an actual soundbite form would turn people away from Donald Trump by turning them to the Mueller report and saying, yeah, this guy's a lot worse than we thought. Didn't happen. Because the stuff in the Mueller report makes Donald Trump look petty. It makes him look like he has quite a temper on him. It paints him in some of his worst moments where he would, for example, yell at his staffers, yell at employees, throw certain people under the bus like Attorney General Jeff Sessions. But none of that is impeachable. Or at least not what the average person would think of as impeachable. I mean, impeachment is technically a political engine, and so they could impeach for that if they wanted to. But as far as what the average person would think of as something that would rise to the threshold of impeaching a president, some kind of constitutional violation, or some kind of violation with ordering the military to do something against the will of Congress, something like that, okay, then maybe you've got grounds for impeachment. But just the Democrats don't really like him, and sometimes he's mean to some of his staffers. Not really grounds for impeachment. Even Bill Clinton's, escapades in the Oval Office are far more grounds for impeachment than Donald Trump yelling at people. And that's pretty much what this amounts to. And so then you had the Democrats on their side, where the Republicans didn't really ask a whole lot of questions per se. I mean, it's not that they weren't asking some questions, but it wasn't a thing where you could tell that most of them were trying to actually get information out of Mueller. And I think that that's largely, not saying that this is a good thing or a bad thing, just observing what is. I think that it was primarily from the standpoint of, well, Mueller has already told us that the report is the extent of his knowledge. That is the collection of everything Robert Mueller knows about Russian collusion and obstruction of justice. Therefore, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for us to ask questions about the content. And so let's just ask some questions on some of his decision making. And it was largely a lot of Republicans just venting about how unfair the process was and how it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense that Robert Mueller had gone to that place to where he was not recommending prosecution, but he was not exonerating either, which is really odd. And I'm not saying the Republicans didn't make a lot of good points. But as far as gathering new information, not really. It was mostly the Republicans venting and Robert Mueller either saying nothing or referring them back to his report. There were a lot of questions he didn't really have an answer for, and I don't know that that painted him in a good light, but the point is I don't think that it actually moved the needle for anybody either. Now, I say all this, I do think that what was going on, and I think the explanation and this hearing, again, didn't really help me develop this theory at all because I said this right after the report came out. It seems to me that what happened is Mueller doesn't like Trump. Mueller wishes that Trump were not the president, but at the end of the day, he is a rule of law guy and an honest person. So he left the breadcrumbs, he left the evidence, and said if somebody wants to pick this up and actually go forward with impeachment, they are welcome to do so. If not, well, I did my job. And that's really not a bad place to land for Mueller. I mean, some of his methods and some of the way that this investigation came about infuriates me, and I think that there's even some evidence of corruption at that point. But the end result was what should have happened, which is, well, there's not enough evidence to bring up any kind of charges or prosecute, so that's it. But the Democrats are trying to play this game where they were trying to get him to admit to the fact that he thinks Trump ought to be impeached. And that's why he sort of left the door open on that. But there's one interesting question on that subject, and this may have been the only part of the hearing that I thought was worth anything out of the whole 5-hour shebang. This is a clip where he's being asked a question by Representative Jim Sensenbrenner, I believe is the way to say his name, of Wisconsin. And he actually made an excellent point here. Again, it's more making a point than actually getting new information out of Mueller, and I think that that's fair. But he actually asked a question not about the report itself, but about the process and how he arrived at his conclusion that I thought was actually well worth watching. Here it is.
Let me switch gears. Mr. Shabbat and I were on this committee during the Clinton impeachment. Now, while I recognize that the independent counsel statute under which Kenneth Starr operated is different from the special counsel statute, he, in a number of occasions in his report, stated that the President Clinton's actions may have risen to impeachable conduct, recognizing that it is up to the House of Representatives to determine what conduct is impeachable. You never used the term raising to impeachable conduct for any of the 10 instances that the gentlewoman from Texas did. Is it true that there's nothing in Volume 2 of the report that says that the president may have engaged in impeachable conduct?
Well, we have studiously kept in the center of our investigation our mandate, and our mandate does not go to other ways of addressing conduct. Our mandate goes to developing the report and turning the report into the Attorney General.
With due respect, it seems to me, that there are a couple of statements that you made, that said that this is not for me to decide, and the implication is that this is for this committee to decide. Now, you didn't use the word impeachable conduct like Starr did. There was no statute to prevent you from using the word impeachable conduct. And I go back to what Mr. Radcliffe said, and that is that even the president is innocent until proven guilty. My time is up.
All right, so that is actually a really excellent question, and the reason that it is he's not asking about the specifics and the findings. He's asking, you had the option of voicing your opinion and doing what Ken Starr did and saying, not necessarily that this rises to the level of criminal activity, but you could have said this is considered impeachable conduct, which is exactly right. And it is fascinating because you do have to ask yourself, because the Democrat narrative on this, and I don't think it's entirely incorrect, I'm just stating what it has been, is that Mueller was incapable of recommending prosecution due to an opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel, which says that you cannot prosecute a sitting president. Mueller himself has said on 3 different occasions that that was not true, that didn't affect his decision in that. He stated that he thought that that was correct, that the Office of Legal Counsel's opinion was correct, but that was not something that influenced his decision on that. And so there has been a little bit of back and forth on that, but that's the Democrat narrative. But here's the thing. What the representative there is pointing out is that, well, yeah, you can't prosecute a sitting president, but there was not a thing in the world that was stopping you from saying that this rises to the level of impeachable conduct instead of criminal activity. And so why is it that you chose to forego saying impeachable conduct? And it's a good question because it completely undermines that narrative. And Mueller seems to kind of stammer and stutter and not really know how to answer that. And then he comes to the conclusion he finally does get out. Well, I didn't want to exceed my purview, except I understand that to a degree. I understand that you don't want to go beyond where the Office of Legal Counsel is supposed to, go beyond your mandate. But again, I don't really see how saying that it would be impeachable conduct does, because Ken Starr saying that in Bill Clinton's case that it was impeachable conduct was not saying, I think he should be impeached. He was saying it rises to the level that at least it could be understood to where the conduct was so detestable that it could get to that point. Now, you could say that it would be conjecture or merely the person's opinion, but the point is, since saying that would not, of course, impeach the president, nor would it automatically begin impeachment proceedings, there would have been nothing at all stopping Mueller from using that language, which the representative points out. And so the question is, if we're going to believe this Democrat narrative that he was convinced that Donald Trump should be out of office, he just couldn't find that smoking gun, and so he left the breadcrumbs specifically because he believes that Donald Trump should be impeached and was trying to lay the groundwork for Democrats to do so, which again, I don't think is a theory that is all that out of place, but you have to admit that that does kind of poke a hole in that theory. Even though it's a theory that I personally subscribe to, I do think that's what Mueller was doing. But the question is, if that's the case, why would he have not used the phrase impeachable conduct? And Mueller would have been familiar with Starr's work. He would have been familiar with that report that came back. So why not do that? It's a fascinating question, and it does make you think. And like I said, even though I subscribe to the theory myself, it undermines the core principle of Mueller was crafting this in such a way to do everything to try to get Trump eventually impeached. See, with that being thrown in there, with that thought, it may downplay that a little bit to the point where you're thinking, okay, maybe what Mueller was actually doing was just saying, here's what we found, do with it what you will. That's a lot different than Mueller was really wanting to get Trump and specifically strategically put this report out in such a way that it would be used as ammo against Trump. I don't know which one it actually is, but I have to say that I had to really reconsider my theory after hearing that. And so that's the only reason that I think that was actually there, but that was actually worth seeing in that hearing. But here's the thing. When it all comes down to it, I think that on either side, this is just bread and circuses. Just like the Romans, back then when the empire was crumbling, if we can give the people bread and circuses, they won't even notice. And that was largely proven to be true, by the way, if you know your history of the fall of Rome. But we're seeing exactly the same thing play out here. We're saying, okay, well, if we can keep them distracted long enough, as long as we can do that, then we'll be just fine. As long as we can do that, then we don't have to worry about them coming after us. And I think that they are trying to keep people preoccupied with what's actually going on behind the scenes. And what is actually going on behind the scenes, we'll talk about that story because I think that story actually is significant and it is something that we should be paying attention to. And we'll get to that in just a moment.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post. Welcome in
I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time once again for another reading of the SJW Bible. Today's story is going to be about how Naaman was cured of his leprosy in 2 Kings, chapter 5, verses 8 through 14. And it says, "It happened when Elisha, the man and or woman of God, depending on how he identified at the time, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, and he sent word to the king, saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Now let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel.' So Naaman came with his horse and his chariots, which were sustainably raised and emitted no greenhouse gases, and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, 'Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean.' Not that I'm implying that you were dirty just because you were a leper. That would be leper shaming. But Naaman was furious and went away, saying, 'Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand all over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Paphra and the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?' So he turned and went away in rage. Then his servants came near and spoke to him, saying, 'Wow, that Elisha guy is such a xenophobic jerk. Where does he get off implying that the rivers in Israel are better than the rivers in our country? That nationalist jerk probably believes in Israeli exceptionalism too.' So then God spoke to Naaman directly and said, 'Naaman, I am so sorry for being intolerant and not accommodating enough. I should never have asked you to have to go and do something to be cured. You believe in me, and since purification comes from faith only, I'll just go ahead and heal you right here and now.' And from that hour forward, his flesh was cured, and they all went out to try some local craft beer." Wow, so inspirational. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us through the break. So here's the story that I think actually does merit some attention. The budget. And Mo Brooks has actually had quite a bit to say about this, and so we'll get to that in a second. But just so you know the background and know what's going on here, the House has just passed a 2-year budget deal, and it passed 284 to 149. And it's important to note that the vast majority of those in opposition to it were Republicans. And so you didn't have a whole lot of Democrats that were upset with it. In fact, the Democrats seem ecstatic. And it was Nancy Pelosi who actually put this deal together along with Senator Mnuchin. So what we're seeing now is a Democrat-based bill, which was passed overwhelmingly, and it is a doozy. It is a lot of money. In fact, we'll get into some of the meat and potatoes here in a second. But all of this was done despite Trump throwing his support behind it. So even though you had primarily Republicans in the opposition, Trump was actually one of the ones that was pushing this deal and praising it and talking about how people ought to pass it. Here's a tweet from the president. "House Republicans should support the 2-year budget agreement." Oh, I'm sorry, that's in all caps. "The 2-year budget agreement, which greatly helps our military and our vets. I am totally with you." You remember the last omnibus bill? You remember that after the government shutdown, there was the fight. And by the way, props to Trump for trying to get the border wall funded. Props to him for trying to cut down the budget to scale back the size and scope of government. But all that's gone now. And you'll remember that the time before, the budget fight that we had directly before that, he said that this was the last time he was going to support a bill like this. You see, a lot of people, including myself, interpreted that as a repudiation of the budget and the size of it. And he said then that the only reason that he was signing it is because he was afraid for the vets and afraid for the military, and that's the reason that he was going to go ahead and sign it into law, even though he was not happy about it and said he would not sign another bill like it. Fast forward to the next budget fight that we have, you'll notice that President Trump does sign it into law after a government shutdown. A lot of us believe that the reason for that was because Trump was trying to be fiscally conservative. That's not true. And this proves it. Because this bill is larger than either of those two. Apparently, the only reason that he was opposed to the other two, or the only reason that he did not like the other two, is because it did not include funding for the border wall, which, by the way, is a worthy goal. I am not saying that Trump shouldn't have made that a primary point. I am saying that the much larger point, the more important point, and the debt, which is far more detrimental to us than illegal immigration, even though it is a real crisis, that's really something that Trump seems to have absolutely no concern for. He is now throwing his support behind a budget that was crafted solely by Democrats, specifically Nancy Pelosi and Senator Mnuchin. Trump, as we've known for a long time, is not a fiscal hawk. But this just goes to show that not only is he not really a fiscal hawk, he doesn't really care about spending at all. Because nobody that is even somewhat concerned with the level of spending in this country would throw their support behind a budget that increases our spending this much. And the debt ceiling has also been suspended as a result of this so that they continue to borrow more money from the Bank of China. So not only does it spend more money than the previous budgets, but it also gets rid of the debt ceiling so that more of that money can be not money in our own coffers, but money that we borrow with interest from other countries. This is this is a Democrat's dream. You can understand why Democrats are 100% in favor of it. This is a budget that's larger than any of Barack Obama's. And what it does specifically is adds $320 billion to our spending. For those of you that are keeping up with it, that is a 6.6% interest or 6.6% increase over the previous budget, which was $4.8 trillion. You'll notice that you don't see a lot of conservatives talking about this. And when I say conservatives, I really should say Republicans, because conservative would imply that you actually do care about the budget. You'll notice that they're all worried about the Mueller hearings and talking about Russian collusion. And I think that's exactly the way Democrats want it. Not letting conservatives off the hook for not talking about it, just saying that the Democrats' plan is working and working perfectly. This is the story that actually matters, because it is saddling Americans now and Americans in the future with a crippling debt and government spending that is at absurd levels and will surely injure our country far more than even fixing the border problem. I mean, it's a big concern, sure. Costs us an awful lot of money. Doesn't cost us this much. And this is really the issue that we're running into. They couldn't even get on board. And what's sad is the vast majority of Republicans opposed this too. Could not even get on board with Rand Paul's penny plan. Just to scale back literally 1% of every area of government and do that to where they get to a balanced budget and can start paying off some of the debts. Won't even do that. Because the vast majority of people in Washington, frankly, do not care about spending. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, for example, another one that is a Republican that really doesn't care about spending, he said that by increasing the Pentagon spending, the deal, quote, achieves the number one goal of the Republican side of the aisle, providing for the common defense. I don't remember that being the number one goal. Now, don't get me wrong. I love our military. And providing for the common defense is an incredibly important priority. Anything that I would believe that would cripple our military, I would be wholeheartedly against. But the reason that Mitch McConnell is bringing this to the forefront is because they got a bump in spending by giving the Democrats basically anything they wanted. I mean, you gave up the whole farm to get one thing that you wanted. And I don't know that we need to increase Pentagon spending anyway. You can't tell me they can't cut at least 1% of the budget. I mean, we spend 20 times more on military than any other country, and I understand why we do. But come on, you can't cut it some? There's no department in the federal anywhere, specifically in the military, specifically in Homeland Security. I mean, yes, those are constitutionally sanctioned important parts of the federal government, but there's waste in them just like there is everything else. See, I always thought, because, this is what Republicans ran on, that the number one priority was scaling back the size and scope of government. Apparently not. Apparently, well, as long as we're getting, more military spending, yeah, let the Democrats spend whatever they want. Let's increase the welfare state. Let's increase government regulation. Doesn't really matter. We got a little money for the Pentagon. We're fine. Yeah, that's not what you people were elected to do. And you can't claim to be the party of small government and fiscal conservatism when the only thing in this budget bill that you can brag about is that you increased spending on a certain part of the government. Now, granted, it's a better part than what the Democrats are spending on, but you still increase spending. And this is why I get so incredibly frustrated with the people in Washington, because Republicans have proven themselves to be absolutely worthless. And there's not a kinder way to say it. They ran for years in the Obama era about, oh, look at the debt. The national debt is skyrocketing. We've got to do something to curtail this. If we don't put Republicans in office to start scaling back this debt, then we're going to go under and we won't be able to do anything. This country is going away. You have to vote for us. We're losing our country. And then they get into office. That's good. Don't worry about it. In fact, here's a little extra money. Here's $320 billion more dollars. Buy yourself something pretty. This is not sustainable. And what's so infuriating about this is when Republicans have power, all that happens for them is they pump the brakes. And I don't mean come to a complete stop. I mean, we were going 150, now we're going 110. I mean, it's better than going 150 towards the cliff, but it's not much of an improvement. Now, if we had enacted some budget constraints, cut the budget somewhat, at least we'd be moving in the correct direction, even if it was little by little. But the Republicans are like, we'll just slow it down a little. Because you'll remember that the excuse that was given to us when we were talking about things like Obamacare and the budget and all the other things that we were worried about back in the Obama era, the Republicans continued to give us this line, look, guys, we can't do much. We have one half of one branch of government. All we have is the House. Not a whole lot we can do about that. I mean, we'd love to scale back the budget, sure. We'd love to cut spending. We'd love to get rid of Obamacare. We'd love to scale back the welfare state. We would love to scale back regulation and red tape. But what do you expect us to do? All we've got is the House. All we've got is one half of one branch of government. Our hands are tied. Yeah, what part of the Congress do the Democrats control right now? Somebody refresh my memory. Oh, right, the House. So the Democrats right now control the exact same part of Congress that the Republicans had back when they had a Democrat president and a Democrat Senate. And they were saying, well, we can't get anything done. We can't get anything that we want. We've only got one half of Congress. And yet the Democrats, that's all they control right now, and they're getting everything they want in the budget. Weird how that happened. The Republicans are utterly worthless because they are progressives themselves. Oh, they're not as progressive as some of the others, but they want the power, they want the control, and they do not care about government spending. They care not about scaling back the size and scope of government, and this proves it. You see, the Republicans are just Democrats light. They still want to control every aspect of your life. They still want kickbacks for their buddies. They still want to spend more and more and more money and charge it to their kids and sell them into debt slavery in order to not have to deal with the political fallout of cutting a few programs. They're no different than the Democrats. They're just slower Democrats. Still going to go over the cliff. We'll just do it at a slower pace, and somehow that's supposed to make us feel better. By the way, Mo Brooks did an interview with WVNN, our own representative here from the state of Alabama, where he pointed out why this is such a horrible plan. It is going to be that much more difficult to deal with because over that 2-year period of time, we will have increased our debt obligations by about $2 trillion under this agreement if the initial reports are accurate. You see what he's saying here? He's saying, my goal is to actually scale back how much money we're spending. But with this budget that we're putting through and everybody's telling us, oh, we'll worry about it later. We'll kick the can down the road. And the Republicans specifically are saying, well, we've got to win this next election, and cutting programs, that would just make us super unpopular. And if that happens, then people aren't going to vote for us. We might lose our jobs. And that's been their excuse, that we're going to kick this past the election so that we can retain more seats in the House and the Senate and the presidency. Bullcrap. And Mo Brooks is calling him out on it. He's saying, not only is this a horrible idea, but if we actually go through with it, then now we have $2 trillion more dollars that we've got to figure out how to pay for. This would be like saying, let's just say, for example, it was your personal finances. Let's say it was the family. And you're looking at the budget, you're crunching the numbers, you're in crushing debt that you know you'll never be able to dig your way out of. And you're like, if I stop spending money right now, the family's going to get real mad at me. So I'm just going to buy the 2 jet skis just to kind of keep them happy for a while. And then, I don't know, maybe in 6 months, a year, then we'll start worrying about the debt. Well, you're going to, even though you're way in over your head, you're going to buy more stuff you don't need and can't pay for. And then when you have acquired more debt, then you're going to worry about it. No, that's not going to happen. Republicans had the House and the Senate both controlled while President Trump was in office, and they did nothing to cut back government spending. Nothing. And if this continues on the pace that it is, then we are going to have more debt. We are going to increase the federal budget double what the Obama years were. President Trump will have doubled what President Obama spent if he continues on the trajectory that he is on right now. Think about that. President Obama by himself had already spent more than every other president in U.S. history combined, and Donald Trump is about to double that. We can't keep this up very long. The walls are going to come in eventually. The debt collectors are going to show up at our door and be like, yeah, it's time to pay up. That is going to happen. And the way that we're doing it now, we're not going to have anything to offer when that takes place. This is not something that we can get away from. And what's horrifying about this is that Chris Cecilia, who works at CNN, he's one of the most vehement anti-Trump people there is at CNN, and that is saying quite a lot. Brian Stelter may be the only one that is more anti-Trump than him. I mean, you've got Cuomo and Lemon and all of those guys. Chris may be, I think, right at that level. And he wrote actually a pretty good piece on CNN's website the other day. I know it's rare that I get to say anything positive about Chris Cecilia, not that I'm looking for opportunities, but this is one of those occasions where he talked about the Tea Party is officially dead. Now, why did he say that? Because this was the final part of Tea Party legislation that came undone with this budget deal. Because back in 2011, they had the Budget Control Act. You remember that after we had the biggest sweep in U.S. history of the House, where Tea Party candidates came in and started actually showing some concern about the budget and trying to scale the budget back, even though they weren't very successful in that because they didn't have the numbers. They came in and the 2011 Budget Control Act was finally passed. And now that's gone. Part of this budget is that it gets rid of the Budget Control Act. So all that work, all that blood and sweat and tears, and we got, 8 years? And, I mean, let's be honest, Budget Control Act was a good thing. It helped some, but did it really get the budget under control? No. So we got kind of a half measure that only stood in place for 8 years. That's the legacy of the Tea Party. And sadly, Chris is right. And why is he right? Why did this happen? Why was this allowed to happen? Because, and keep in mind, I was there. I was a member of the Tea Party. I did all of it. I continue to go to Tea Party events and meetings. But Chris is right. This is the last legacy of the Tea Party, and now it's gone. And why is it gone? Because of President Trump. Now, Trump has governed far more conservatively than I thought that he would. I've given him credit for that. And there's a lot of things that Trump has done that I really applaud, really love. Neil Gorsuch moving the embassy to Jerusalem. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm saying the purpose of the Tea Party, T stands for taxed enough already, was to lower taxes and lower government spending. Well, we do have the tax cuts, but Trump has done nothing but increase spending since he came into office. And it's not all Trump's fault. The Republicans in the House and the Senate have done exactly the same thing. But what happened there was a fascinating phenomenon. That you saw members of the Tea Party, and I'm not just talking about people that claim to be a part of, I'm talking about actual members of the Tea Party. You saw a split taking place. You see, there were some members of the Tea Party that were true believers that actually thought that it was a good idea to be fiscally conservative and were actually concerned about that and voted for people that pushed that message. And then you had people that the second Trump came down the escalator to elect his presidency, they were like, have you seen how that guy drives Democrats crazy? Have you seen some of the things that he says that their heads just explode? I'm voting for that guy. Yeah, those people were not fiscal conservatives and never were. They weren't even really conservatives. Now, I'm not talking about the people that voted for Donald Trump when he was the only option left. I'm not, even though I didn't do that. I'm not talking about people that felt like, it's him or Hillary and it's a binary choice. Again, I didn't buy into that philosophy, but I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the people that were looking at a field of very talented candidates, several of which actually were budget hawks, and we're talking about lowering taxes and lowering government regulation and doing something about this crushing debt that is hanging over our head like the sword of Damocles. And saw all those people and said, yeah, but I mean, that Trump guy, come on, he's a fighter. He hits back. He says nasty things about the media. Okay, that's good. Granted, that's one of the things that I like about Trump. But you get what you voted for. And unfortunately, we're getting exactly what we voted for. See, the good thing about President Trump, even though I really hated that time and the turbulence and the way that people turned on one another, one thing that it did do is it separated the men from the boys. It showed who was actually serious about getting taxes and getting government spending under control and scaling back the size and scope of government, and who just really didn't like Obama and the Democrats. That's what it showed. Because there were some people that anybody that'll punch Obama in the face, rhetorically, of course, I'm saying there. Now I have to clarify that. Anybody that will poke at the Democrats and make them look dumb, I'll vote for that guy. And whoever does that the best, that's the one I'm going with. And that happened to be in this race Donald Trump. And granted, he is good at that. But what I really hate about it is it shows that the vast majority, well, I don't know about the vast majority, but at least a large plurality of the Tea Party, they were never really concerned about taxes or spending. They just didn't like Barack Obama and didn't like the Democrats and what they were doing, a sentiment I share with them. But that became priority one, and they really didn't care about whether or not the government was spending, $4 trillion a year or not. Just was not a thing for them. Didn't really care about constitutionalism. All they cared about was getting somebody that would stick it to the Democrats. And if that's as deep as your philosophy goes, if that is deep as your political philosophy drives you to, if that's really what's at the core of who you are, I don't think there's a lot of agreement between the two of us. We may agree on some policies here and there, but that's not what I'm in this for. That's not what I showed up to do. I mean, I don't like the Democrats either. Sometimes it feels really good to stick it to them. But that's not the reason that I do this. This isn't a team event for me. It's not like a game. It's not like a football game where I just picked out a jersey, picked a team to root for, and then jumped on that bandwagon and rode it out. That's what a lot of the people that were early Trump supporters, that's what they are. Anybody that can beat the other team. They're not asking the question of, what are we actually doing? What are we actually here for? They just want to win. And that's not the purpose of what our founders set out. That is not what people like Jefferson and Washington and Madison envisioned. In fact, they specifically warned against it. They were worried that it would tear the country apart, and I hope that it doesn't. But we already had that happen once. Then it was at least primarily over an issue that actually mattered. I'm afraid this time it may happen merely over a cult of personality. And I would hate to see that happen to my country. Vast majority of the Tea Party simply didn't believe in the message that they were preaching. And I hate to see that. We'll take a quick break.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
All right, here we are. So you guys remember last year, one of the things I talked about in a segment called Straw Wars is how the liberals, despite no scientific evidence or backing whatsoever, believe that somehow they are saving the sea life by banning plastic straws. In response to this, Mellow Mushroom has started giving out paper straws as opposed to plastic straws. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how effective the paper straws are with the most difficult drink to drink, a milkshake. Let's see how this stands up. All right, so first of all, I got about 2 sips out of that, and the paper stuck to my lips. This thing does not work too well. Boy, it'd take you 2 hours to drink this with this.
Well, see, I'm using plastic.
That's John from Millbrook, by the way. He's the one driving.
I think they use plastic because that's the best thing to use.
This thing sucks. Well, actually, it doesn't suck. If it sucked, I'd be fine with it, but it doesn't. This milkshake will melt before I finish this. All right. Experiment over. It's biodegradable. All right. We're going to fix this now. There we go. Good old petroleum-based plastic straws. Oh, that's so much better.
I got a question about this.
Oh yeah?
With the paper, aren't they concerned about the trees, having to cut down the trees to make the straws too? Is that not a...
Well, that's one of the points that I made. It doesn't matter what you make the straw out of. You're expending some kind of resource.
Well, yeah, because we all live here.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, it doesn't matter what you make any product out of. You're expending some kind of resource. Mm-hmm. And that's true of straws or anything else. Well, I tell you this. Just based on this little experiment, I know that I saw that Disney is planning to go completely paper straw by 2020 on all their cruise lines and all of their amusement parks. I contend that Disney World is not the happiest place on earth if I can't drink a Dead Blame milkshake while I'm there.
But I will, to their defense, say one thing.
Oh?
You can take a pocket knife in. So help me.
That's something.
Yeah.
Anyway, alright, so even though this went about the way I expected it to, paper straw experiment failed miserably. I imagine if I had left it in there much longer, it would have dissolved. I had a buddy the other day that went to a place that used paper straws. He said he had to order 6 different straws throughout the course of his meal because they kept dissolving on him. Which I'm sitting there thinking, you can't tell me that using 1 plastic straw is worse for the environment than 6 paper straws. I mean, that's just common sense. Anyway, alright, thanks guys. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my milkshake.
And welcome back, everybody. So I'm sure that you are all waiting with bated breath about the newest news when it comes to Ilhan Omar, because this is actually not a recent happening, but it is recent that it actually surfaced, because apparently this is an old interview, but somehow nobody saw it, probably because it was on Al Jazeera. And so we actually do have new video that hasn't really been making the media rounds until just the other day about Ilhan Omar. So we'll go ahead and watch that.
A lot of conservatives in particular would say that the rise in Islamophobia is a result not of hate, but of fear, a legitimate fear, they say, of quote-unquote jihadist terrorism, whether it's Fort Hood or San Bernardino or the recent truck attack in New York. What do you say to them?
I would say our country should be more fearful of white men across our country, because they are actually causing most of the deaths within this country. We should be profiling, monitoring, and creating policies to fight the radicalization of white men.
Well, there you have it. The problem of terrorism, just like everything else, the real problem is white men. It's hilarious that no matter what the problem is, no matter what different angle that you can take it on, it's always the white man's fault. And this is sort of the philosophical basis of most of Ilhan Omar's beliefs. I mean, she's a Democrat socialist Muslim, so yeah, they pretty much assume that if there's a problem in the world, it's probably a straight white Christian man's fault. I mean, that's pretty much how it goes, right? So this is the assertion that she has come up with. But the thing is, it's completely wrong. And we actually did this research and disproved this back in November when Don Lemon said essentially exactly the same thing. That when it came to terrorism, it makes no sense to be afraid of Muslims, because the real terrorist threat is white men. White men are the ones perpetrating most of the terrorism in this country. But if you look at the research, that's actually completely untrue. And we talked about this back then as well. So just to show you this graphic. So this is all research that was done by FBI Crime Statistics. This is where I'm getting my information. And I went back 30 years. And you'll notice that I broke each of these down by race. And then that last chart there at the bottom, that is the whole thing from 1990 to the present. And so if you'll look at those totals, what that shows is, if you're looking at the percentage of the attacks, the ones perpetrated by Arabs in that 30-year period, or almost 30-year period, that there were 44 attacks by Arabs and 47 by white people. So that constitutes 44% versus 47%. So technically, white people are committing more acts of terror in the past 30 years than Arabs have. But there's something else you need to be aware of too. Look right next to that at the number of deaths and the percentage of deaths. Even though white people have perpetrated 3 more acts of terrorism than Arab people, if you're looking at the dead, there's way more deaths. When it comes to Arab versus white, the Arabs have 92% of the deaths and 88% of the injuries of all terrorist attacks combined in the past 30 years. And that's even more significant when you consider that if the population of the United States, white people make up 76.6% of the American population. Arabs make up 0.01%, which means if you're looking at your terrorism per capita, per million, that for every million people, 0.1 is a white person, which means you would actually have to look at 10 million white people to find one terrorist among them. With Muslims, it's 12 per million. So many, many times the rate of white people. And just so you know, looking at this data, I counted each individual event, even if they had the same attacker. And the reason that that's significant is that in the ones that I looked up, you're less likely to have a Muslim commit more than one terror attack because typically what they do at the end of it is that they commit suicide. So I gave the Arabs, the Muslims, every advantage in this. I gave them every benefit of the doubt, every advantage, because I counted each individual event, even if they had the same attacker. I also did not count terrorists killing themselves in the death toll. So again, not even using that to bolster the numbers of deaths. And yet, I still found that Arabs are over 64 times more likely to engage in terrorism than any other race. In fact, if you combine every other race's terrorism per capita, it still does not measure up to even 1/120th of the rate that Arabs commit terror attacks. And what you might say there is, well, yeah, Caleb, but the thing is, 9/11 will skew the numbers. Throwing 9/11 in makes it look worse than it is. Now, granted, 9/11 is a big deal. But even if you take 9/11 away, look at the 2010 to the present chart that's there right above the total one. Even in an era where 9/11 did not take place, the past 9 years, 51% of the attacks were still committed by Arabs. The only reason that they look comparable on the 30-year chart is because you're counting the 1990s, where there were significantly less. Since the year 2000, Arabs have been responsible for more terrorist attacks, more deaths, and more injuries. And all of this considering they are a much, 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 much smaller part of the population than white people. White men do commit more terror attacks since 1990, but that has changed in the past 19 years. And attacks by Arabs cause 13 times more deaths and 8.1 times more injuries than attacks by whites. There's just no comparison. There's just not. The numbers do not bear that out. They don't even come close. And that's even more astounding when you consider how much larger a population white people are in this country versus Arabs, and Arabs are still committing more acts of terror in the past 18 years. But even though that is all true, and Ilhan Omar could not be further away from the truth, that she is completely, systematically wrong on every conceivable level. Even though that is true, I don't even think that's the most significant part of this. Because it really shows the kind of person Ilhan Omar is. You'll notice that her response is not, I don't think that people should be afraid of Muslims, or I don't think that we should be doing racial profiling. Which, by the way, I'm sympathetic to that argument. I don't want somebody stopped and checked or searched just because they happen to be of one religion or one race. I don't think that that's right. Now, I do think that we overcorrected in worrying about that a little too much to where you were less likely to get searched if you were an Arab or you were a person of the Muslim faith, because they were so afraid of being accused of racial profiling that they wouldn't check those people. Now, that was an overcorrection on our part, and that was a mistake. That was one of the big mistakes of the Bush administration. But nonetheless, if you just came at it from the argument of, I don't want a person stopped and checked or having, extra scrutiny placed on them because of their race, because of their religion, totally understand that. That's not what Ilhan Omar did. The first words out of her mouth were, people should really fear white men. And then a little later in the interview, you saw her also say that we need to profile them. This is nothing but tribalist nonsense. You see, and this is the problem with things like slavery reparations, for example, or any kind of discrimination. Look, the intended goal should be, let's just treat everybody equally. Let's treat everybody the same. If there is one race that is discriminating against another, let's work to end that. That's not what the left wants anymore. They want vengeance. They want specifically to tear down another race to build another one up. She didn't say, let's just not profile people based on their race. She's saying, oh no, we need to profile. We just need to profile white people. It's an incredibly barbaric philosophy. They did it to us, so we're going to do it to them now. It's our time. A long time ago, white people oppressed black people, so now what we're going to do is we're going to turn the tables on them. Well, for a long time, men have been oppressing women, so now we're going to have women oppress men. We're going to have extra rights that they don't get to have. People are going to believe us and not believe them, as opposed to the way that it used to be where people would believe the man and not the woman. Well, that happened in the past, so now the solution to that is we're going to get privileges over them. We're going to get special treatment over them. That's not the way this works. The spirit of reconciliation is that you come together and you end the bad treatment, not we get to do the bad treatment to you this time. That would be like if you're looking at two siblings that are in some kind of fight and say, Mom, he hit me, so I'm going to hit him back now. That'll make it fair. No. The solution is for nobody to hit anybody. The solution is to stop. That's what we should be striving towards. That's not the way Ilhan Omar thinks. She thinks that we ought to just be able to repeat whatever incorrect action was perpetrated against the one that was the victim in the first place. And sure, that did happen some. But the solution to that is not now, okay, well, now let's do it back to them. And the thing is, this isn't necessarily a racial thing anyway. Because when it comes to profiling of who might want to be a terrorist, I think that there's some profiling and some benefit of the doubt that is okay to extend to some people, not because of race. For example, if there is a guy who is covered head to toe in tattoos and, looks shady and looks like he's doing something that he shouldn't be, I don't have a problem with that guy having a little extra scrutiny placed on him as opposed to a black grandma. An 88-year-old black granny, I don't think that she should be placed under the same scrutiny as a big white guy with tats all over him, and you're pretty sure that he knows what prison food tastes like. Like, that kind of profiling I understand based on even a person's appearance. But this idea that we should be specifically profiling only this race, and that we should be seeking and targeting them, that doesn't fly regardless of what the race is. It's wrong to do either way, and it's against who we are as a country. But all this is coming on the hills, and I guess that this is the reason that this story resurfaced in the first place. Judicial Watch has now filed an ethics complaint on her. And the story is far too complicated to explain on a show like this. And the truth is, I don't have the visual aids and I don't have the staff to do the level of research that is needed to understand the story. It's a very difficult story to flesh out. So I urge you to not just take my word for it, do your own homework. But essentially what happened is this. This is the story as we know it so far. Ilhan Omar came over here out of a refugee camp in Somalia. We suspect, based on a substantial amount of evidence, and again, there are different people that have done really good work on this, specifically Glenn Beck over at The Blaze. They just put out a special, I think, yesterday on Ilhan Omar that is really good, and it explains all this a lot better than I can, so I'm not going to delve into the details. I'm just going to give you the brief summary. So what happened is that she was in a refugee camp, and there was another family that was going to be able to bring people out of Somalia. And because of that, they lied and said Ilhan Omar is a member of our family. Omar actually isn't her real name. And if you know anything about the Somalia refugee crisis, 80% of the Somalian refugees that have had DNA testing done on them, we know that they are not actually related to the people they said they were. Now, there's been no DNA test on Ilhan Omar, so we don't have conclusive proof that this happened. We just have records and other evidence surrounding it that lead us to believe this. So again, this is why I encourage people to do your own homework and don't take my word for it. So what probably happened is that they said, we've got to get people out of here. We're going to try to get Ilhan out of here. And so because of that, we'll say that she's an Omar. And here's the thing. I don't begrudge a parent. Even though I understand that it's a felony and it's illegal, it's hard for me to put myself in that position and say, if somebody told me that they could get my daughter out of a war-torn country where there was a good chance that she would be captured and abused or even killed, I don't know that I go ahead and go along with that. So, on that one, no judgment, at least from me personally. The law will judge you as it judges you. But for my part, I have a hard time saying to that person that they shouldn't have done that. But nonetheless, let's say that takes place. Well, you fast forward a few years and Ilhan's about to go to college. And her brother, who again would have been, legally not an Omar, his name hadn't been changed. She goes ahead and says that she's marrying him. And they have a marriage ceremony, and that is used as the rationale behind having this guy immigrate to America because they are legally husband and wife, even though the suspicion is that they're really brothers, or that they're brother and sister. But they did that so that he could come over to America from England, which is where he was. And then they get a tax break and a tuition break because they are living as a married couple in the same house, which is also super suspicious because they're also living with her other husband, which Ilhan Omar may be the only Muslim in history that did it backwards. Instead of a man having multiple wives, she instead had multiple husbands at the same time. But anyway, so she's living in the same house with other husband and her brother husband. And they get tax breaks, they get tuition breaks, all of that because they're a married couple. And so this is really where the story heats up. She also testified that she needed a divorce and she wanted to file for a no-fault divorce. And one of the conditions for that is that the other party cannot be reached. She said, this guy is over in England and I haven't spoken to him in 3 years, except we found photo evidence that she actually was on Facebook and there was a picture taken of her with this guy. So at the very least, even if none of the other stuff pans out and turns out to be true, at the very least, we have it on pretty good authority that she, at the very least, committed perjury by lying to the court. But then, because she was able to get her legal no-fault divorce, you look at everything else, and you've got tax fraud, which is a felony, immigration fraud, which is a felony, and fraud against a state university, which is a state-level offense. And so there's plenty of evidence here to, at the very least, say, look, we need to start an investigation and we need to look into this. Now, does that take the form of an FBI investigation? Does it take the form of perhaps a grand jury? I don't know. But the point is, there is way more than enough smoke to at least pique somebody's curiosity and say, we need to look into this person. And that is the reason that Judicial Watch has filed an ethics complaint against her at the House. So it looks at the very, very minimum. We've got her committing fraud against her school, the IRS, and the Immigration Department. And even if all that goes away, there's pretty strong evidence that at the very least she was lying about the last time that she had seen her then legal husband. So I think all of this hits the fan, and honestly, this is my prediction on this. I think what you're going to see is that she actually is going to go down for this, and she will get ousted from the House. And a lot of people are going to say, well, no, she's a Democrat. She's very popular. Actually, she's not. Her approval ratings are literally amongst swing state Democrats. They're in the single digits. That's how bad her approval rating is. So I don't think that that's really an argument. And here's the thing about her being a Democrat. Yes, she's in a very powerful position. And yes, the Attorney General of her state is the person that used to hold her position, Keith Ellison. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he decided not to pursue any charges, even when her hometown newspaper brought this to people's attention before. Oh no, that was after the election. That he's essentially said, oh, there's nothing to see here. But even so, I think the Democrats want her gone. Not AOC and Rashida Tlaib and the other chick that's in the squad, but Nancy Pelosi and the other establishment Democrats. They don't like her. They don't like what she's saying. She has become a political liability to where they have had to dance around. You'll remember that when she said the anti-Semitic stuff, that immediately Congress, well, they came out and they were going to denounce her, but then they had to water it down, and then they decided to just denounce all hate sort of generally, so they didn't have to specifically point out Ilhan Omar. The truth is, I think the Democrats have been looking for a reason to get rid of her for a while. They would probably also like to get rid of AOC too if they could, but they know that that's politically dangerous and they don't really have any kind of standing other than we don't like her and she makes us look bad. Ilhan Omar, they actually have something on her now, and I think you're going to see her go away probably before the end of the year. It's a bold prediction, but I'm guessing somewhere around October, Ilhan Omar is gone. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. Let's go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And today's Daily Dose of Stupid brought to you once again courtesy of Bernie Sanders. Here's a tweet by Bernie. It has been 10 years since the federal minimum wage was raised. Since then, education expenses are up 65%. Food costs are up 26%. Healthcare costs are up 21%. Housing prices are up 16%. $7.25 is a poverty wage. We need a living wage, at least $15 an hour. So that's Bernie's wisdom for the day, I guess. A couple things that I wanted to point out because he basically just undermined his entire argument in his tweet, if you understand what he was saying. Do you notice a pattern about each one of the industries that he just went through? Because I don't doubt necessarily his numbers. There's one I'm a little suspicious of because of food. I can't figure out where he got that one. And as we learned just the other day when Rashida Tlaib was talking about it, the price of milk and eggs have actually gone down in the past 6 years. But anyway, let's look at the industries that he was talking about where prices have gone up. Well, education. When you're talking about higher education, there are significant subsidies and grants. In fact, we even have the government running schools specifically. And so there's a lot of regulation there. They have government-run agencies that license different institutions of higher learning. And you also have tons of grants. And of course, there are subsidies on tuition. And the government literally runs the student loan company. That was actually, or the student loan people. They actually took over that segment of the market during the Obamacare thing. That was one of the things that people kind of forget that Obamacare did. That was something that was included in the bill. So with education, heavy government regulation, heavy government subsidies. All right, what about food? Well, they have an awful lot of farm subsidies, and the USDA gives an awful lot of money. And you also have, under the same USDA, the SNAP program. So on both sides of the equation, you have government giving money to farmers to make it cheaper to produce food, theoretically. And then you also have them giving money to low-income people to try to buy the food. So you've got them working both ends of this. And yet, prices are going up. All right, let's look at healthcare. Well, first of all, you've got the massive Obamacare overhaul with literally thousands of pages of regulation and red tape that is supposed to protect us and was supposed to bring prices down. You'll remember that President Obama even promised that the average family of four was going to see a decrease in their premiums by about $2,500 a year. Yeah, it turns out it actually went up by almost $4,000 a year. So not exactly the price reduction you were hoping for. So we've got Obamacare, and then we have Medicare and Medicaid, which by themselves make up about half of the federal budget. So even before Obamacare, we were still spending almost half the federal budget on just Medicare and Medicaid by themselves. So massive government spending, massive government subsidies, and all kinds of regulation. I mean, the FDA, it takes, last I checked, and it's probably even gone up since then, it's a little over $100 million, if I'm not mistaken, to get one drug approved by the FDA because of the battery of testing that you have to go through, that kind of thing. So yeah, very, very heavy government regulation and government spending. And then you've got housing. Well, the government, of course, has Section 8 housing, low-income housing. And then they also have government subsidized loans for houses, which are pretty common. And then you've also got subprime mortgages. You'll remember that that's the reason that we had the stock market crash back in 2009, is that the government was telling banks, no, you will give people this loan, even though you know that they can't pay it back because they're low income, so you have to give them the loan even if they can't pay for it. And that's what caused the housing bubble. So in all four of the examples that he just gave, all four of them, heavy government regulation, heavy government subsidies. It's almost as though the things that are going up the most in our society are the things that the government got involved with and screwed up. Which is ironic because Bernie's solution to all of these things is let's get the government more involved and spend more money on them. Now think about that. Everything that we're talking about, they all have this commonality. And he's saying, well, we need more of that. We're a very rich country. We're very wealthy. We need to have more of the things, more of the free stuff. That's Bernie's solution. Let's spend more money on it. We're already doing Bernie's solution. That's the point. We're already doing Bernie's solution. He is basically holding up a testament to the failures of his own ideology. That all these prices are going up. Yeah, they're going up. Because we've been doing what Bernie Sanders would have wanted to do for a very long time now. And so it's so absurd that he's actually making a case against his own ideology and doesn't even realize it. And in 3 out of those 4 industries, food being the only exception, the government actually plays an active role in that market. And what I mean by that is they're playing an active role in all of their markets, but I mean they're actually a participant. Because in education, even though it's state organizations mostly, because you don't have federal universities, but in the form of education, You have state governments running those. And in the healthcare market, you of course have the Obamacare healthcare market. And so the state actually runs a section of that. It's participating in the market against private companies. And that's also true of housing, that you have them working as loan propagators, and they're actually building houses and participating in the housing market through Section 8. So not only do you have heavy regulation and subsidies, but in 3 out of the 4 things that he's talking about, the government actively participates as a force in that market, a provider of those services. And yet you wonder why they're screwed up. You notice that one place where prices aren't going up, for example, is technology. It's not going up for laptops or TVs or cars. Why? Because the government's not involved in those things. Well, they kind of are in cars, but that's going a little bit more out of the wayside, and even then, prices are still coming down. But what's fascinating about this is the way that he ends this tweet. You may remember, I'll bring it up here. He ends this by saying that $7.25 is a poverty wage, and we need a living wage at least $15 an hour. Did Bernie forget that this week the story broke that his own campaign workers are unionizing? Bernie Sanders' campaign workers are unionizing because they weren't getting paid $15 an hour and were working 60-hour weeks. They were making roughly 12 to 13. And so they're working for a guy who is saying that it is immoral and it's a poverty wage to pay people less than $15 an hour. Turns out he is not even paying people $15 an hour. And when this happened, his response to them unionizing, we found out, was, okay, well, we'll pay you $15 an hour, but the only way that we can do that is to cut your medical expenses, which, by the way, they didn't get full medical. But he's saying for the medical that you do get, your insurance, you're just going to have to contribute more to it. So effectively what they were saying is you'll get more money out of pocket, but you're also going to have to contribute more to your medical. So you're going to be effectively making the same, because that's money doesn't grow on trees. That's the only way that we can do that. And then they were revolting because they're saying, but Bernie's saying that healthcare is a human right. And that's what he says all the time. Healthcare is a human right. Says that all the time. That's his favorite thing to say, because it is a human right. And yet, he's saying, I'm going to take away your human rights because you want $15 an hour. So you're either going to get poverty wages or you have your human rights violated. And what's hilarious about all this is they finally decided not to do it only because the media picked up on it. It was such a massive debacle in the public eye. And so what they decided on is they were going to scale their hours back from 60 to 50, and that they were going to cut hours of other employees that weren't working as much. So in other words, they reacted exactly the way that a business would if you suddenly raise the minimum wage on it. Bernie just got a hard and fast lesson on why $15 an hour doesn't make sense. And yet he's still continuing to push this absurd idea that, anything less than $15 an hour, the market needs to regulate that. Anything less than 15 is just unsustainable. People can't live off of it. And it's immoral to deny a person health care or to pay them less than $15 an hour, even though, by the way, I'm doing both. Socialism is for the people, not the socialist. Bernie Sanders is saying this because he wants the government to mandate it. He doesn't want to be held to the same standards that he wants to hold others to. We saw the same thing with the debacle with the book. You'll remember that his response to that was, well, if you write a best-selling book, then you can be a millionaire too. Yeah, which is what capitalists have been saying since forever. He does not hold himself to that same standard. And by the way, let's look at this central claim that he's making about poverty wages at $7.25 an hour. Now, granted, $7.25 an hour, not a great wage, but let's look if it's actually poverty wages. World Bank has set the poverty threshold at people living off less than $1.90 a day. That's their poverty threshold. So in other words, if you make over $693.50 a year, because that's how much that comes out to if you multiply it by 365, if you are making over $693.50 a year, you are by definition not in poverty. That's how they see it. That means that if you make $7.25 an hour and you work full time, that you are making $15,080 a year, which, by the way, is 21 times higher than the poverty threshold we were just talking about. In fact, if you were working full time for minimum wage, you are making $290 per week, which means in only 3 weeks, you are above the poverty threshold at $7.25 an hour. You literally don't even have to work an entire month full time on minimum wage in this country to exceed the poverty threshold for the world. Now, let's say you're not working full time. Let's say you're just a part-time employee. Let's say you're a student or something like that. You're only working 10 hours a week. I lowballed this as much as I can because surely nobody would hire someone to only work them like 5 hours a week. But let's say you're only working 10 hours a week. And let's say that you're working minimum wage. Well, that still means you're making $72.50 a week. So in only 10 weeks, only takes you 10 weeks, not even 3 whole months. In 10 weeks, you have already surpassed that threshold. Heck, you only have to work for 1 hour and you're many times over what a person has to live off of, $1.90 a day, for the poverty threshold. Now, I know that the natural response to this is going to be, well, yeah, that's the world poverty threshold, which, yeah, that's the world poverty threshold. That's the point. Is that when you're comparing it to other countries that don't have our system, that threshold is much lower. But the American poverty rate, you'll say, is $25,100 for a family of 4. Yeah, that's substantially larger than the world poverty rate. In fact, it's over 36 times larger than the world poverty rate. That's how high it takes to be out of poverty, considered out of poverty in America. And it's 36 times larger than the rest of the world average. Why is that? Because of our system. Because we have at least mostly a free market. Goodness knows it's not nearly as free as it needs to be. And we put all kinds of regulations and shackles on the free market that we once had. But the reason that we still have the highest poverty threshold on earth, and it's 36 times higher than the rest of the world, is specifically because we believe in free market principles. Private property ownership, you have the ability to make as much as you can earn, that kind of thing. And the government doesn't oversee the means of production or raw materials. And so say what you want to about it, but at a certain point you have to say scoreboard. And Bernie Sanders claiming that $7.25 is poverty wages doesn't change the fact that the system still works infinitely better than anywhere else in the world. And another thing about that, only 542,000 people are actually earning minimum wage. In other words, they're actually in a job where they're earning this rate. You know how much of the American population that is? 0.2%. And the vast majority of the people actually earning that minimum wage are teenagers. People working part-time at a job, they don't have a family to support, and so this idea that, well, we have to have a living wage, that's absolutely absurd. The vast majority of people that are working minimum wage are doing just fine. And they're certainly not living in poverty by any logical person's definition of it. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report comes from the book of Daniel, and this is our final entry into Daniel. We are down to the last 3 verses, so I'm really excited about that, and I have to say, working our way through the book of Daniel has been an absolute joy. And it is one of my favorite books of the Bible. I really appreciate the way that it, just brings God's providence into very clear view. But our time is winding down, and it's important to note that when it comes to the book of Daniel, the vast majority of the last, I would say about the last third, it may even be safe to say about the last half, but the last third for sure of the book of Daniel is entirely prophecy. It's these different symbols and what they mean and what's to come. And then Daniel kind of wraps it all up with a bow in these few verses after receiving the prophecy from Daniel 12:11 through 13. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335th days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. The important thing to understand about this verse, it gives a very noticeable tell. Do you notice that Jews, even Orthodox Jews of today, no longer offer sacrifice? They don't actually sacrifice animals, bulls, goats, and put them on the altar and offer sacrifice to God the way that they did back then. You notice that that's actually predicted right here in Daniel. And to understand how significant that was, that wound up in a prophecy, do you understand how insanely absurd it would sound to a Jew living in Daniel's time, saying that there's going to be a time where Jews don't even offer sacrifices anymore? That would have been unconscionable to a Jewish person living in this time. In the same way, I imagine that it probably sounded for a man like Noah to tell people, look, God's going to open up the skies and water is going to fall from the heavens onto earth and flood the whole place. To them, that sounded absurd. And to the person that was reading Daniel before this happened, that probably sounded pretty absurd to them. And so, since we have that historic marker, when did the Jews stop doing that? The sacrifices stopped after the sacking of the temple in 70 AD. And by the way, we've seen this phrase used here, the abomination of desolation. We've seen that used and talked about how the other prophecies also coincide with Rome coming in and destroying the temple and sacking Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. And so what's really important to understand about this is that even though it would have sounded ridiculous to a Jewish person reading Daniel's prophecy at the time that there was going to be a time that came where sacrifices were no longer offered, Daniel accurately predicts not only that it will happen, but he predicts when it will happen. Hundreds of years before it took place. You see, that's what's so amazing about this. A lot of people accuse prophecies in the Bible of being essentially a fortune teller, and one of the tricks that a fortune teller will often use is what's known as a rainbow phrase. In other words, it's so broad, it's so sweeping, it's so generic that it will cover just about anything. So, for example, you may hear someone who is a fortune teller say, I'm sensing some anxiety in your life. Well, what person doesn't have anxiety in their life? All of us are worried about something. And so they use these broad sweeping phrases to sort of draw you into the idea that they really are predicting the future or reading your mind or something. If you're doing that, if it's all smoke and mirrors, if it's all a show, you don't get specific and you never say anything that would sound ridiculous, because then they'll automatically assume, even if you happen to be right, that you're wrong. I mean, if I were to say to you tomorrow that the Zimbabwe is going to invade America and take it over, you would say, okay, you're off your rocker, and you'd be right. The reason this particular prophecy is very significant is because Daniel is predicting something that would have been unheard of, and no one would have even thought that there would be a time that would come that the children of Israel stopped offering sacrifices to God altogether. And yet he predicts that it will happen and when it will happen, which really is a massive testament to the foresight of God presenting this to Daniel in such a way that I'm sure Daniel was a little taken aback and didn't even fully understand what was going on himself. In fact, we saw a few verses ago that he didn't really understand what was being said. And then God gives this explanation here. And another thing that's interesting is what comes directly after that prediction. He's saying that there's going to be a day of tribulation, and he who keeps waiting and attains these days, that person is going to enter into rest and to be comforted, and that you will gain a portion allotted to you at the end of the age. So what's important here, and I think that it is specifically talking about the sacking of Jerusalem, as I've already said, that it's saying that that person that endures until after the sacking of Jerusalem and remains faithful to God even in a very turbulent time, that person is going to be greatly rewarded at the end of the age. And there really was an end of the age that took place there. The sacrificial system was no longer there, and I don't think that it's a mistake that that was only a few years after the death of Jesus Christ, the one true ultimate sacrifice. But it's important to note here that the overarching message was true for them then. And even though I think it was specifically talking about them, it is a message that we can apply to our own lives, much in the way that a narrative in the scripture teaches a moral lesson that can apply to our lives. A piece of advice that God is giving to future generations that now have passed can still apply to us today. And that principle is those who see through these turbulent times and endure and keep the faith, those people will be given a reward at the end. And that's a great faith. That is a blessed assurance, as the song says, that we can look forward to. That we're going to face all kinds of tribulation and trials and turbulence. We may not see something quite as horrific or as bold or as history-making as the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. But we're going to see things in our life that feel that way. We're going to see things happen that we can't explain and that will seem very daunting to us. But as long as we endure and hold fast to God and the teachings that He's given, and just like they could look at God's Word and get a preview of things to come up, we can do the same thing. Maybe not in a very literal sense like they could. But can't we look at God's Word and understand the principles and understand God's wisdom in dealing with man and His understanding of the human heart and apply that to our lives and to situations we're going to come up in? Of course we can. That's part of the reason that He left it to us. And so as long as our faith in God remains strong, there will be no earthly event that will be able to shake that faith. And just like there were people that remained to the end that had that patience when the temple was destroyed, we as Christian people can have that same level of patience and faith that at the end of all things, at the end of time, that if our faith in God is still strong, we will be given a portion at the end of the age as well. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.